Hello everyone, today we read and comment the 8th chapter of the 3rd book of von Clausewitz Vom Kriege, its title being Superiority of Numbers. The text follows. This is in tactics as well as in strategy the most general principle of victory and shall be examined by us first in its generality, for which we may be permitted the following exposition. Strategy fixes the point where, the time when, and the numerical force with which the battle is to be fought. By this triple determination it has therefore a very essential influence on the issue of the combat. If tactics has fought the battle, if the result is over, let it be victory or defeat, strategy makes such use of it as can be made in accordance with the great object of the war. This object is naturally often a very distant one, seldom does it lie quite close at hand. A series of other objects subordinate themselves to it as means. These objects, which are at the same time means to a higher purpose, may be practically of various kinds. Even the ultimate aim of the war may be a different one in every case. We shall make ourselves acquainted with these things according as we come to know the separate objects which they come in contact with. And it is not our intention here to embrace the whole subject by a complete enumeration of them, even if that were possible. We therefore let the employment of the battle stand over for the present. Even those things through which strategy has an influence on the issue of the combat, inasmuch as it establishes the same, to a certain extent decrease them, are not so simple that they can be embraced in one single view. For as strategy appoints time, place, and force, it can do so in practice in many ways, each of which influences in a different manner the result of the combat as well as its consequences. Therefore, we shall only get acquainted with this also by degrees, that is, through the subjects which more closely determine the application. If we strip the combat of all modifications which it may undergo according to its immediate purpose and the circumstances from which it proceeds, lastly, if we set aside the valor of the troops, because that is a given quantity, then there remains only the bare conception of the combat, that is, a combat without form, in which we distinguish nothing but the number of the combatants. This number will therefore determine victory. Now, from the number of things above deducted to get to this point, it is shown that the superiority numbers in a battle is only one of the factors employed to produce victory, that therefore, so far from having with the superiority in number obtained all, or even only the principal thing, we have perhaps got very little by it, according as the other circumstances which cooperate happen to vary. But this superiority has degrees. It may be imagined as twofold, threefold, or fourfold, and everyone sees that by increasing in this way it must at last overpower everything else. In such an aspect we grant that the superiority numbers is the most important factor in the result of a combat, only it must be sufficiently great to be a counterpoise to all the other cooperating circumstances. The direct result of this, that the greatest possible number of troops should be brought into action at the decisive point. Whether the troops thus brought are sufficient or not, we have then done in this respect all that our means allowed. This is the first principle in strategy, therefore, in general as now stated, it is just as well suited for Greeks and Persians, for the Englishmen and Marathas, as for the French and Germans. But we shall take a glance at our relations in Europe as respects war in order to arrive at some more definite idea on this subject. Here we find armies much more alike in equipment, organization, and practical skill of every kind. There only remains a difference in the military virtue of armies and in the talent of generals, which may fluctuate with time from side to side. If we go through the military history of modern Europe, we find no example of a marathon. Frederick the Great beat 80,000 Austrians at Leuthen with about 30,000 men, and at the Schlossbach with 25,000, some 50,000 allies. These are, however, the only instances of victories gained against an enemy double or more than double in the numbers. Charles XII, in the Battle of Narva, we cannot well quote, for the Russians were at that time hardly to be regarded as Europeans. Also, the principal circumstances, even of the battle, are too little known. Bonaparte had at Dresden 120,000 against 220,000, therefore not the double. At Kolin, Frederick the Great did not succeed with 30,000 against 50,000 Austrians, neither did Bonaparte in the desperate battle of Leipzig, where he was 160,000 strong against 280,000. From this we may infer that it is very difficult in the present state of Europe for the most talented general to gain a victory over an enemy double his strength. Now, if we see double numbers prove such a weight in the scale against the greatest generals, we may be sure that in ordinary cases, in small as well as great combats, an important superiority of numbers, but which need to be not to be over to one, will be sufficient to ensure the victory, however disadvantageous other circumstances may be. Certainly, we may imagine a defile which even tenfold would not suffice to force, but in such a case it can be no question of a battle at all. We think therefore that under our conditions, as well as in all similar ones, the superiority of the decisive point is a matter of capital importance, and that this subject, in the generality of cases, is decidedly the most important of all. The strength at a decisive point depends on the absolute strength of the army and on skill in making use of it. So in this first half of the chapter that we discussed today, von Clausewitz proceeds, first of all by extraction, by degree, to explain what is the importance of numbers in war, how this basically occurs to be at some point the determining one, and from that passing eventually to the concrete reality and observing how in the wars of his time, at least in the 18th century and the early 19th, essentially number has gained a specific importance in numerical quantity at the point that a relation 2 to 1 is considered differently from other times he identifies in the past to a substantial security of victory, at least in what appears to be like a pitched battle, right? And therefore it's an approximate judgment, right? Von Clausewitz here is not stressing by any stretch of the imagination that numbers are by themselves the most important factor in absolute terms, right? But in relative terms, he observes that this is definitely an imposing one, and that especially in conditions that get closer to symmetry, it's obvious that number is gonna decide in many ways how the thing will, the outcome of combat. This is important because here he reiterates the fact that fundamentally in his times, European armies were all alike, right? There were just minor differences, but they were substantially doing the same job, and therefore what really made the difference at that point is, besides the virtue of the army that we have explained previously in other video, and the talent of the commander, the ability of the commander, definitely numbers are important. And from this, especially, we will see this in the next video, in the second half of the chapter, the numbers should be employed fundamentally in greater quantity as possible, coming to the decisive battle. Once again, this is an asymptotic statement. Von Clausewitz here is not saying that this should happen all the time. This doesn't even say that it may be the objective of a strategy or even a specific tactic, right? He even says, there can be easily the disparities at the point of even 1 to 10, and considering that certain things cannot even be done easily from the larger army against the smaller one. But from this, the thing evolves fundamentally from this broader, let's call it symmetric combat, approximately symmetric combat, where let's say numbers still have this substantial importance to be felt and perceived. But once again, von Clausewitz is not expressing in any way the absolute statement that numbers are the only important thing, that you can't win all the time just by having larger numbers. He's really saying that there is a concomitance of factors that usually brought in his times to this relative ratio of 2 to 1, right, in practice of warfare, that is derived not by a specific a formula that is just descending from the skies, right, but simply because the political and social systems that produced the armed force to clash against each other are at this point in history, like unlike other ones that can happen, balanced from that around that number, right, in something approximately symmetric, in a pitched battle, for example. So this is important because we will see it, especially in the second half of the chapter, the next video, that there is an important result that descends from this. That is that theoretic, and this goes back straight to the beginning of the Vom Kriege, when von Clausewitz says that if it was possible, war would have to be fought basically all in one shot, right? Ideally, intentionally, right? If war was something unmitigated by this infinity of factors that are basically unpredictable, the action, the greater and fuller commitment of forces would be actually not just preferable for the sake of victory, but also for even sparing people's lives, right? Von Clausewitz says, it's pretty naive to believe that a war can be less bloody just because, it's less intense, right? The thing should be as fast as this, as quick and as total, if you want, as possible to actually skip that. Unfortunately, reality obliges not to take this path, because sometimes it's even counterproductive. On average, this remains still true, ideally, but once again, in every situation occurs so many other factors that by itself this principle is of little practical use, right? But it has a concept within it that is connected to a series of other issues we have touched that have to do probably mostly with the moral forces, like with the motivation, that once again it's not just a purely military thing, actually it's a political one, and derives from society, and lots of things you cannot reinvent just from a military point of view only. So this is very complicated, but naturally it brings to the realization that it's properly a political let's say task, duty, to bring, right, to commit all those forces in the field, ideally to obtain victory. This is particularly important because, once again, in turn, it implies that politics and society should be as much committed as it's needed to winning this war, and that theoretically, given it this 2 to 1 numerical ratio, right, it would be possible just to field in his own times, right, that number of troops to most of his times winning, right? The problem is that this is not on the table all the time. This is not possible, as a matter of fact, all the time. And this is an important realization that von Clausewitz also derives from the military thinking of the previous generations, right? In 18th century warfare, where, let's say, there was a more conservative attitude, probably not much because of relatively to the broader sources of account relate, but the actual capability of the states to field certain armies, and therefore wars were in a way less decisive, because objectively, I mean, the 18th century is is a moment of balance, right? With the Napoleonic Wars, things change. So the reasons why this overwhelming number of people in a national war that von Clausewitz lived through, even at his own expenses, and eventually, redeeming with the redemption of his own country, passed through the levies here of, in fact, hundreds of thousands of people, even millions of people, considering Napoleonic Wars altogether, people in arms properly. So this has all this deeper significance, and it is not to be exchanged just for essentially a tactical tip, like be 2-2-1, so everything will be easy, right? It's not the case. Things change also over time, and especially what is the system, this combat isolated from the others, right? And once again, in a battle, you could fight in a way that has apparently not much to do with your broader goal should be, but it's contingential of that specific moment that you can't fundamentally even decide by the majority, right? You can just sometimes cope with accidentally, and this derives naturally from the cases mostly of strategy per se, and then of course of tactics as well, that as the two ones interplay. So von Clausewitz, superiority of numbers. Von Clausewitz writes, this is in tactics as well as in strategy the most general principle of victory, and shall be examined by us first in its generality, for which we may be permitted the following exposition. So here, von Clausewitz says, that the most general principle of victory, this is probably intended by von Clausewitz also in military history in general, right? Throughout all the eras, really, not just in his own, right? It's obvious that numbers in themselves are an imposing, substantial factor that you can't take out, right? Those are not just, passive elements of chess pieces, right? Man-can or things like these, right? They are fundamentally human beings that are there to fight you, to kill you, and also driven to do it in ways that at that point are to be expected to be different and sudden and accidental, right? And the point is that these, from the perspective of numbers alone, these things tend to naturally to coagulate. This is really, as von Clausewitz even says this, that there are many factors now that need to play in here that we shall observe step by step. We will encounter them, but it's as if these numbers, after all, and we've seen it even from previous chapters, made of this with moral forces, all of these masses essentially acting as one, right? So the importance of the number is the importance of quantity in situations which I would put it in this way, that in which if symmetry was too high, probably there wouldn't be such an enormous field. And you see, if you feel so many troops at once, right, because you count on quality, you count on quantity, for example, over quality, you still have to consider that, yes, you can intend the thing to go like that, tactically speaking, but that also entails that you have to commit, in fact, larger amounts of people. You may not have, actually, most of the times. Think about more primitive armies that maybe to beat the quality have to gather in greater groups. The point is, if the enemy is qualitatively superior, has brought those troops there, the thing may even work, but the point is that you are also committing proportionally a lot of energies and resources that are as high tendentially as the ones of the enemy to even hope to be able to win, right? So the thing acquires a deep strategical value because numbers are not infinite, right? And as we were saying before, you can't always have this numerical advantage at hand, right? Because most of the times you can't even influence that, if not outside even of the military sphere, actually mostly in the political one, and how this also reflects on society. So von Clausewitz writes, strategy fixes the point where, the time when, and the numerical force with which the battle is to be fought. So strategy is actually determining most of the times, given the available armed forces, in fact, where, when, and with how many troops you're going to fight, right? So strategy must consider this aspect in a way that naturally is always connected to politics and the counter right at home, but that is the one that is militarily responsible to gather the troops effectively and to bring them to fight. And Clausewitz says, by this tribal determination, it has therefore a very essential influence on the issue of the combat, right? As combat, it is going to, the battle is going to be determined by the number of people who fight in that, and all the other elements like the motivation. All the reasons brought those people to fight in there. The same combat, right? So it's obvious that there is this reciprocal interaction between strategy and tactics that always passes through this. If you want, not speculator, because strategy is more important, but there wouldn't be any tactic, if it wouldn't be any battle if it wasn't strategy, and vice versa. Von Clausewitz writes, if tactics has fought the battle, if the result is over, let it be victory or defeat. Strategy makes such use of it as can be made in accordance with the great object of the war. Right? It is to say, in a battle, you essentially get there to defeat the enemy army, but how you're going to exploit eventually that advantage is a matter of strategy. Right? That could go in different directions in this regard. Right? And in fact, von Clausewitz says this object is naturally often a very distant one, seldom does it lie quite close at hand. That is to say, in a war, think about World War II. How many campaigns, how many battles had to be fought just to get to the end? Was it Berlin, readily at hand? No, right? The thing took, was Japan readily at hand? No, right? So there is a path here that, as we've seen even in previous books, took different steps, right? It takes different steps to be covered, and essentially you don't know which path this is going to take, right? Think about, Churchill that wanted to invade Europe from Africa through Greece, for example, to reach the Romanian oil fields, etc. Then eventually the American line prevailed, but even in there, where they would have attacked, Sicily, Sardinia, eventually these were all different paths that were potential options. We've seen how important, strategically speaking, these potential options are, right? For strategy itself, from Clausewitz, they actually come to influence the same decision per se, even things that have not yet occurred, right? So what von Clausewitz is saying here is fundamentally that you can't you can't think that the resources that you're employing, right, to fight battle by battle, are always to be proportioned in this regard to the ultimate object of the war. That is to say, numbers here have little to do with winning the battle itself, but winning the war overall. So even the reasons, as we were saying before, that bring to have, for example, a substantial numerical advantage may not be strategically, may be true tactically, but they may not be convenient strategically. Right? They may be even inconvenient strategically, tactically. It really depends. It's not always true. And von Clausewitz writes, a series of other objects subordinate themselves to it as means. These objects, which are at the same time means to a higher purpose, may be practically of various kinds. Even the ultimate aim of the whole war may be a different one in every case. Right? Let's always bear this in mind, that ideally, as we've seen many times, if war was, let's say, unrestricted, absolute in the Latin sense of the term, it would fundamentally to be fought in that spark, right, in that only one shot, right, with this incredible intensity. In reality, this doesn't happen, right? It can grow as totally towards that direction, but still it would require an immense effort that could, realistically cannot be gained, right? Total war, absolute war, in reality does not exist, right? And this is really Clausewitz in principle. So even think about those people who accuse von Clausewitz having, dictated the the National Socialist idea of Totalen Krieg, for example. This is not correct, right? There was an ideal, there was an absolute towards which to tend that can't be a real thing, but in reality, it can be a real thing as an intention, ideally, right? But in reality, it's going to crush against, if anything, against physics, but also the same human capabilities, even the moral ones. And even the National Socialist example is a pretty good one if you consider how it ended. So in reality, the point of this last period von Clausewitz wrote is that wars may not have the ultimate object of really, committing all your forces, but just, for example, containing an enemy, or, tiring him up to one point, or waiting, maybe just keeping him busy while something else is happening on another front, maybe where you're waiting for an ally to enter the thing. So once again, these are all proofs that the numbers per se in reality are not everything in absolute terms. Then von Clausewitz says, we shall make ourselves acquainted with these things according as we come to know the separate objects which they come in contact with, and it is not our intention here to embrace the whole subject by a complete enumeration of them, even if that were possible. We therefore let the employment of the battle stand over for the present. That is to say, given that, right, this idea of committing arbitrarily as many forces as possible is good for a tactical purpose, still war may be fought in a way that has a very few to do with that, right? In which you may not even engage an enemy in open battle, for that matter, just fighting guerrilla style and winning anyway, right? So the principle doesn't come less, once again, in asymptotic terms, right? It however differs for every different value you give to that curve, right? So von Clausewitz here addresses the thing by extracting it to make us understand better where the importance of numbers really stands per se. If you want a reasoning ex absurdo for von Clausewitz standards, and he writes, even those things through which strategy has an influence on the issue of the combat, inasmuch as it establishes the same, to a certain extent it decrees them, are not so simple that they can be embraced in one single view. For as strategy appoints time, place, and force, it can do so in practice in many ways, each of which influences in a different manner the result of the combat, as well as its consequences. Therefore, we shall only get acquainted with this also by degrees, that is, through the subjects which more closely determine the application. That is to say, once again, even if we stuck just to the tactical dimension, and observe this, of course, for the sake of combat, winning battles, still strategy has this influence on combat, for which even in the same combat we may come less to this generalization that numbers are all that matter in absolute terms. Then we will see how this varies in fact a difference, a specific circumstance. So von Clausewitz writes, if we strip the combat of all modifications which it may undergo, according to its immediate purpose and the circumstances from which it proceeds, lastly, if we set aside the valor of the troops, because that is a given quantity, then there remains only the bare conception of the combat, that is, a combat without form, in which we distinguish nothing but the number of the combatants. Right, so never make the mistake of interpreting this abstraction as what von Clausewitz is assuming as to be real in, let's say, aside from this, the forces involved in the abstraction, right? This has nothing to do with the decisiveness, right? It's taking away the other factors from the equation and just looking at this bare naked, if you want, value of numbers that in an abstract, here it says in a combat without form proper, remains to be that most general factor that seems rightfully to be very important in this regard in combat. That is the sort of abstraction that you find often in debates about military stuff, like what if we cross out all the possible factors and just look at the sheer get at least certain specific values that here if you just remain with number, of course you will understand how that is important. But you could say just, I don't know, the virtue of an army, or the quality of its commanders, and then let's take out this tactical disengagement from any other context, right? If we do so in complete abstraction, so once again, this is nothing to do specifically, right, in absolute terms, let's put it in better terms, with reality, right? This number, von Clausewitz writes, will therefore determine victory, right? Determining here, I should check the original text, but it's important because at least on Schwerpunkt, I say it just in my terms, it's not deciding, right? It's different. It's obvious that this determines victory, and in this case, at least the translation, I don't know, has, however, a the objective, of course, of saying that it decides the encounter. And of course, if you take only one factor, right, that there are numbers, this is what you will get. And then von Clausewitz writes, now from the number of things above deducted to get to this point, right, it is shown that the superiority in numbers in a battle is only one of the factors employed to produce victory, that therefore, so far from having with the superiority in number obtained all or even only the principal thing, we have perhaps got very little by it, according as the other circumstances which cooperate happen to vary. Guess what? So, however, in turn, von Clausewitz writes, but this superiority has degrees. It may be imagined as twofold, threefold, or fourfold, and everyone sees that by increasing in this way it must at last overpower everything else. That is to say, even once again by abstraction, this really gives you the the understanding of what I mean by asymptotic. Here there is an exponential growth, right? Let's imagine that in this sense number increased indefinitely. I mean, there is a point at which, like any other factor, increasing, amplifying, intensifying, can become decisive, right? Not just in the most important in relative terms, but most important in absolute terms. This is still an abstraction. And von Clausewitz writes, in such an aspect we grant that the superiority in numbers is the most important factor in the result of a combat, only it must be sufficiently great to be a counterpoise to all the cooperating circumstances. The direct result of this, that the greatest possible number of troops should be brought into action at the decisive point. This is where von Clausewitz is really getting to. What we were saying in the beginning, that is the implication of the importance, let's say the implication of the importance of numbers, not for combat, let's say for the sake of itself, but naturally also for the strategical reasons that, say, the strategical, or better, as we will see now, the political motivations that can bring to that. Right. This is very important because once again, we cannot know in any given clash how many troops are gonna be enough to get the thing done. But there is surely an ideal measure under that point of view, which is, because this is just a numerical and material side of story that of course cannot be taken even here in the physical world as extrapolated from, for example, the exponential difficulties that present themselves with increase of number, for example, from a logistical point of view, or attrition, and this idea, as we will see now, that even influence military theory at the point of saying, we just don't have to put as many troops as we can on the field, but just the right amount that doesn't screw up logistics, right? And that's why eventually even military theory had stopped to that at one point, to the fact that, I don't know, in the 18th century, of course, there were states that risked to be wiped out at every second, including Prussia, right? It was achieving this extraordinary tactical feats. We later on, for Clausewitz mentions Leuthen and Rosbach, just for example, but this has nothing to do with the fact that Prussia could be wiped out from a moment to another, just had the Russians wanted it at some point, or something had, look at the miracles of the House of Brandenburg, right? So that had, without saying, a dramatic impact in the way the Prussian state was built and its armed forces were actually, because even in that situation, you see that the Prussians managed to defeat these larger forces that are together, maybe just with the English armies of the of the 100 Years' War of the 14th century, the beginning of 15th. Essentially in conditions of symmetry that von Clausewitz will explain now, the strongest armies in history, and from that we also learn an important let's say practical military notion, that is to say, the outcome of a battle can be measured numerically speaking with effect, in the sense that it's very meaningful that those victories occurred, right, especially in a row, right? That is, as von Clausewitz will point out here, definitely not common, even for those time standards, right, and for military historical standards, for that matter, because literally these are the only examples in history which we can't be sure of that. We can historically document to be real about those numerical ratios. So once again, this is just ideal, aside from the historical example, which is very concrete, to say that we could augment number of troops to achieve a victory if we only had the means or the political will, right, and all that follows from that. So von Clausewitz writes then, in such an aspect we grant that the superiority numbers, in the result of a combat, only it must be sufficiently great to be a counterpoise to all the other cooperating circumstances. It is to say, let's augment troops so much that even if other difficulties increase, for example, from a strategical point of view, from a political point of view, or social point of view, at least we can gain on the field that tactical advantage, and essentially, and consequently, also a strategical one, given that, that victory. Also, von Clausewitz writes, the direct result of this, that the greatest possible number of troops should be brought into action at the decisive point. But this is also another aspect of it, that is, that strategy is responsible of, let's say, once it's received a political mandate, that is, strategy is the one that decides, as we have seen, when, where, and how many troops get to fight. Right. So this strategical principle is aimed at satisfying fundamentally what should be considered as the decisive battle. Also, what is the decisive battle is a very difficult thing to actually assess. In the Vom Kriege, von Clausewitz will arrive to say, ironically, but actually correctly, that the only decisive battle is the last, right? And it is true, because what is the decisiveness anyway, and what is all what fundamentally revolves around that specific battle, right? The forces involved are by themselves much greater and could have taken other turns, right, to to meet the enemy in a different situation, and therefore we wouldn't be talking about the same battle in about the same circumstances, given that at some point the options were not so. I mean, the situation was not different, but just remodulated in another contingency, in another situation. So these are all very important concepts to bear in mind, so that you do not get fooled once again, pretending to say that there is a golden section you can fundamentally employ at all times just by a mathematical notion, right? And you just can build up your armored forces at every moment and bring them to fight in the circumstances that you prefer, right? This is not going to happen when you need, but you can work very hard for getting closer to that level of decisiveness and that amount of troops, right? And indeed, if you look at battles in history, indeed, there has always been kind of a climatic moment, right, in which, of course, it seems that, in the course of the World War, a battle was, if you want, the one that turned the tides, right? But this still doesn't tell us whether the tides could be turned further had other disasters occurred, right? Then, let's say, presents itself the ability of the commanders that also kept pushing through, right? I mean, there could be so many other setbacks that at that point may have, for example, brought the war to go in a different way. Maybe not even to get to the end, to the destruction, the occupation, the conquest of a country, for example. But they could have stopped in the middle. We don't know. So there are many other, let's say, factors, of course, and many other potential battles that can be fought and essentially eliminate the title, the objective of decisive to a specific battle. Also, and especially given that until the war is over, you objectively do not know whether that battle has been decisive. Right? This is particularly important. And this also, I would say, deepens and widens these strategical intuitions, right? Because, in such great wars, historically speaking, what is that has been truly what's the battle has been truly decisive, right? If you look at Midway or El-Alamein or Stalingrad, you start saying, these are probably the biggest things, but what if actually those factors that had brought to Midway, to El-Alamein, to Stalingrad had, been shifted by other events, which might have happened because there were many other factors that could have gone, simply in a different way, right? And just think about German logistics on the Eastern Front. I mean, things could have been done better, right? Or I don't know, the strategic scenario of Eastern Africa. That was a hell of an important one, very very overlooked one that instead brought to a probably decisive. Let's say here I'm saying decisive, but to that turning point in the African campaign during World War II. So that's why von Clausewitz is right when he says that the decisive battle is only the last, because that's really the one that will essentially make the enemy give up any other fight, to surrender, in other terms, right? To stop fighting, to at least to be compelled to fulfill your will, which is the objective of war per se. But how this objective translates itself in a reality mitigated by politics and by society, that's a wholly different matter. So this literally goes from the battlefield to the ultimate political decisions, right? And as we know, these are pretty importantly interrelated. So von Clausewitz says whether the troops thus brought are sufficient or not, we have then done in this respect all that our means allowed. This is the first principle in strategy. Therefore, in general, as now stated, it is just as well suited for Greeks and Persians, for Englishmen and Marathas, for French and Germans. right? So this is a principle that, of course, by the sheer mathematical nature of the statement, of the abstraction, yes, of course, it is true. The more you increase the number of troops in a battle, and it doesn't matter who you're going to fight, because we have never met here historically an army that couldn't be overrun, right, in absolute terms, or couldn't be bogged down, or that had to win just for the sake of it. And don't compare different, let's say, realities, let's say, from different times, because as we were saying before, when we evaluate the odds and look at how, in fact, people's fight against each other, we have to understand naturally the context, but also the fact that if a conflict breaks out in open warfare, that is because who fights is in that traumatic situation and says, okay, it's better to fight now, because we have the at least hope, a consistent one, looking at the odds, to actually win this war, right? And we know pretty well how even very advanced armies were defeated by more primitive ones, even, right? And how wars can easily be lost even in conditions of, but what I was about to say superiority, but what is superiority in a context that changes continuously, right? Von Clausewitz makes some examples, including the ones from the 7 Years' War we were making before, because he writes, Frederick the Great beat 80,000 Austrians at Leuthen with about 30,000 men, and at Rosbach with 25,000, some 50,000 allies, right? So this is respectively, actually even less than 1 to 2. Actually, even more than 2 to 1. Let's put it in better terms, and 2 to 1, respectively. Right. So, von Clausewitz says these are, however, the only instances of victories gained against an enemy double or more than double in numbers. I think we skipped here in the previous paragraph that von Clausewitz wrote, if we go through the military history of modern Europe, we find no example of a marathon, because at marathon, as you know, they at least given the sources, the Greeks were more 1 to 2 to the Persians, or even less. So von Clausewitz uses the battle here as a sort of stereotype of that ratio, and he observes something that is definitely true, that in a war like the one of the 7 years, and more generally in 18th century warfare, has now, he also mentions Narva at the beginning of the century, the disparity in numbers was actually very low, right? At least in terms of victories achieved, right? It was normal for armies to be fundamentally 2 to 1, to constantly defeat the smaller ones. Von Clausewitz writes, Charles XII of Sweden in the Battle of Narva, we cannot well quote, for the Russians were at that time hardly to be regarded as Europeans. Also the principal circumstances even of the battle are too little known. So he refers to this dramatic and climatic battle of the beginning of the Great Northern War, where the Swedish infantry basically even charged into the Russians in a defensive position, and with less in numbers, but being at that time the best army in Europe, and overwhelming the Russian army. So that's what eventually triggered the most of the, at least of Peter the Great of Russia's military, let's say, westernization of the Russian army, with these military reforms that brought the Russians, that's what von Clausewitz means here, to be regarded as Europeans in military terms. That is, introducing linear tactics, and abandoning this kind of still mix of melee, horse archer, mostly creating a linear infantry, and modernizing artillery, and making important use of shock cavalry, and so on, right? And And von Clausewitz says, but we fundamentally don't know much about the Battle of Narva in itself, because, historically speaking, to say that, for example, whether this was completely true, I mean, how were actually these quantities, etc. So here it's the scrupulous military historian that says, okay, we also have to be real in, taking certain numbers sometimes that it's all we have, very often in battle accounts, and say, yeah, this army won and the other lost, but are we sure about the numbers? Specifically, can we study that battle tactically? It's not always possible. And I've never studied the sources of Narva itself, but I presume that, yeah, I mean, we don't know excessively much of a war, fought, in detail about tactical engagement, even if a major tactical engagement between the Swedes and the Russians at the beginning of the 18th century. I mean, these are, two distant, let's say, distant times and places. Let's call it this way, from the core of, Western, the documentation of the time. Then von Clausewitz makes other examples. Says Bonaparte had at Dresden 120,000 against 220,000, right, and therefore not the double. So once again, this is important. It doesn't reach 1 to 2. At Kolin, Frederick the Great did not succeed. Right, his defeat actually against the Austrians with 30,000 Prussians against 50,000 Austrians. Right, and this was not even 1 to 2. It's more. Neither did Bonaparte in the desperate Battle of Leipzig, the Battle of the Nations, where he was 160,000 strong against 280,000. Right, so that is to say, a double would have, if it would have been double his forces, if the enemies had been 320,000 instead they were less, right, and he was defeated anyway, as you know. So these are examples that are interesting because bring in even the Napoleonic Wars, where, as you realize here, the numbers have dramatically increased. Right, already the battles of the 70 Years' War were imposing, but here we're talking about hundreds of thousands of troops engaged from from each side during Napoleonic Wars in a single battle, and these are numbers that are astonishing. I mean, of course, the Napoleonic Wars have been the most devastating ones in the history of mankind up to von Clausewitz's time. So this is important because the numbers have increased proportionally now to the country's possibilities. Of course, Europe was improving also, in thinking about industrial capacities, technology, etc. So there were better means now that triggered even this, the revolution, the national state, the creation of nation state, the mass levies, etc. But as you know, a battle like Leipzig was definitely a turning point in Napoleonic Wars, as Napoleon lost basically in one shot Central Europe, and France was on the defensive now. And the point here is that the fate now of many nations was in this regard in a single battle decided with such enormous numbers that made the difference, surely, right? Had these numbers decreased, right, let's say at Leipzig, how are numbers important? Had the Allies been 200,000, maybe, I don't know, Napoleon might have been might have won, right? So that number had been by itself a quite important one. It hadn't surpassed yet even the 2-to-1 advantage. So this means that overall, European armies were, with the exception maybe of the Prussian victories of the 70 Years' War, that also, however, as we've seen here with Collins, suffered, were cited also by defeats, and quite important ones that, as we were recalling before, threatened to wipe out the in fact Prussia herself. I don't remember what it was. Yes, the fact that the difference 1 to 2 is never reached. That that European armies fundamentally were of this kind of different quality. Of this asymmetric level that didn't exceed that 1 to 2. To make it very simple, but once again, this is not just a tactical factor. Right, because behind those numbers there are entire countries that brought all those people together. So von Clausewitz gets, says, from this we may infer that it is very difficult in the present state of Europe for the most talented general to gain victory over an enemy double his strength. There we're talking about Frederick the Great, we're talking about Napoleon, so the greatest commanders of their time, the greatest geniuses. So now, if we see double numbers prove such a weight in the scale against the greatest generals, we may be sure that in ordinary cases, in small as well as great combats, an important superiority of numbers, but which need not to be over 2 to 1, will be sufficient to ensure the victory, however disadvantageous other circumstances may be. Right. The point is, how disadvantageous the circumstances are gonna be are paradoxically homogenized over time, right? Because even if things can always go, worse, and von Clausewitz definitely, was a great, that's an option, right? We also know that this has to do with a theory of, with certain statistical dynamics that, in general, also tend not to be like the worst possible scenario, right? Of course, there is always the need to project that in a way to be safe, right? And this is something that happens mechanically in armies, right? In these major armed forces, like these hundreds of thousands of troops engaging in a single battle that have been, fed, kept, motivated. I mean, they all, entire countries, as we've seen, have prepared them to do that, and it's pretty rare in this regard that, in fact, countries would grow so different, these systems would grow so different to to make this also these other disadvantages or advantageous respectively complementary circumstances can come to interfere, right? That's also why we're pointing out the 1 to 2 scenario, because if, let's say, things had gone terribly wrong for the Allies at Leipzig, right, we could have hired this, level. We could have seen, say, that, maybe even that it was sometimes possible even to get greater victories in specific circumstances. It also seems possible, mathematically speaking, that this greater difference, statistically speaking, gets to be smaller the more people are from both sides, right? It seems so, right? That is, the more you accumulate and the more you make an effort to add that extra more, so that after all the base is going to remain the same, and the increase in troops, the disparity of troops is going to be always smaller in proportion. So consequently, the outcome will be statistically probably more even than if paradoxically it was a stronger, let's say a smaller number but a stronger numerical asymmetry. Then von Clausewitz says, certainly we may imagine a defile which even tenfold would not suffice to force. This is the point we're making. But in such a case, it can be no question of battle at all. That means that, if one force is, one army is engaging, one is 10 times larger, in this specific context, let's say early 18th century, early 19th century warfare, where the point is that probably there are some circumstances, like a very strong terrain, a very strong position, or other, advantageous factors for that army to be so confident to gain battle that you can't, the conditions are such that that is likely not going to be a pitched battle, right? And in fact, we do not have cases of victories of armies in open field in that regard that fought 1 to 10, right? Unless they were very small, I presume. I found them in other contexts, for example, but when you look at larger battles, you don't find 1 to 10 and the 1/10 army of the larger one winning, right? This is very important, very, very important, because you understand that together with those numbers that we were saying before, it increases the bet and therefore the commitment also to make things going better. That is the great thing, and it's really an important realization. That is, you can't send, let's say, think about the Battle of Cameroon or the Battle of Fort Alabama. Like all these events that sound desperate. Not even the Thermopylae are, because technically the Thermopylae there were tens of thousands of other Greeks next to the Spartans, and they went away. The Spartans were surrounded. So that's another thing. It's plenty actually, even in regular battles, to see basically all the time during the collapse of the defeated army, a pocket of troops that resists to the death, also allowing the others to escape more easily, right? That's perfectly normal. But in fact, it's not a battle anymore. That's the point here from Clausewitz is making. That's something different. In that case, it's just a sacrifice. But in other circumstances, it can be an extremely strong position that you can't, for example, besiege and not to storm. Right? It's full of such examples in military history, even Napoleonic era. There can be a stronghold that doesn't matter how large the army that besieges is that maybe hold out for if there's a dramatic numerical disparity. So this is what von Clausewitz is talking about. And once again, this is not to be taken as if von Clausewitz was just reasoning as in terms of his own time's perspective, because guess what? Pitched battles have always covered this dramatic role, right? In climatic role in wars, right? And since antiquity, it is today, right? So things change, proportions change in a way, but many times it's also very difficult to pretend. Once again, it's a matter of numerical ratio in the first place. There is an average in general, and this is interesting. It actually made me think something, but it's completely useless in this sense for my thesis. In the sense, let's figure out how often these victories in great numerical disparity great numerical inferiority actually happen. But the point is that would be the smaller clashes, and those are the least important. So von Clausewitz, he doesn't conclude, but we conclude, because we arrived at one half of the chapter. We will talk about the rest next time. Right, so we think, therefore, that under our conditions, as well as in all similar ones, the superiority at the decisive point is a matter of capital importance, and that this subject, in the generality of cases, is decidedly the most important of all. Right? The strength at the decisive point depends on the absolute strength of the army and on skill in making use of it. That is, especially with the last phrase, that is very well put. That is, as we have seen, there are many factors. Mostly the general's ability, the virtue of the army, and the numerical element. But at the decisive battle, where the largest amount of troops are gathered, as we have seen before, the superiority numbers is more important than in smaller clashes, right? And this, as we will see, especially later on in the Vom Kriege, this is not just a matter of moral destruction, but of physical destruction, but of moral impact, right? There are, in this sense, victories from which that can really bring an end to war, and that in that sense are decisive. And there are big battles, and in this sense have been decisive, right? It's not. It's more difficult here to find great wars in which, in fact, even great powers were able to put in the field great numbers and arrive to this climatic battle that it turns out to be also the decisive one. But generally speaking, such events happen. Look at the ancient world, for example. In the ancient world, this is pretty evident, right? But even in there is still the political element that takes over, like in all military history, and therefore you can find many situations like I don't know, the battle Cephalai, where the Romans defeated Macedonia but didn't wipe them out, and that was dramatically useful for them to counter the Seleucid invasion of Greece, just for example. So once again, this is just a numerical game, if you want. But the important here is that for the strategical consequences themselves, for the structural impact that the wiping out of a major enemy force in open field has to do with the whole progress of the campaign, right? That is really overwhelming and can facilitate the whole thing later on. And this happens naturally the more you concentrate in one shot, which, as we have seen, is rare to find in the odds to be, it's rare to find actually in the same numbers to be so frequent. That's why the thing is interesting here, is that there is a struggle between the asymptoticity, there are two axes here. The one is the cost that you have to bring all those troops on the field. The other is the advantage that this confers, right? And there is naturally a balance between the two. So it's a pity, because guess what? You can't always do that. And it turns out that if you do that, the enemy is also more motivated to bring more people in at that decisive point. And the point is that if the enemy refuses to fight, that is probably not a decisive point. So this has an enormous strategical significance, because it makes you understand that what is strategically the decisive at this point is a commitment that tends to level the odds, to level the asymmetry, and to bring to this climatic battle that is very often not ever to be given for granted, as smaller encounters usually instead are. Even if because even if we have seen, actually we didn't explain this, even if we have seen that it's more likely to find this 1 to 10 win in smaller clashes, this is much more random, because these minor clashes have less strategical significance, and therefore there is less strategical commitment to them. But it's easier to say to see in military history the smaller operations actually being more successful, because the enemy tends to either not meet you in open field, and therefore to let you do what you want strategically, and also to be overwhelmed in the smaller parts the major enemy force can encounter, and then to meet you instead in the climatic battle, where the situation is going to be more leveled, right? This is very, very important, because it really makes you understand that war tends to symmetry, right? The odds tend to be fairly balanced in war. To even happen in the first place, to even break out from the political branch, let's say, to decide to engage in war, and you can understand easily why, because what is at stake is much higher. So you tend not to make inconsiderate bets for something so important, right? And that's also what brings to this numerical disparity, this great numerical disparity, rare after all, and therefore also the numbers, most of it ideally very important, but in practice rarely important, because that will be the case all the time, but you will not be able most of the times to bring enough troops to have that superiority, right? So this conclusion is of dramatic importance for acquiring strategic culture, because if you get this, you really get the sense of the balance that most of the times war has, that reflects the strength ratios in here, mostly also in a moral term, right? That number is meaningless without that motivation, without the political mandate, as we've seen. And this also is what von Clausewitz will explain in the second part of the chapter that we will see next time. So I hope you'll keep this stuff in mind, because we will come back on it many times, and in general it's really fundamental to understand warfare and strategy in its especially strategy, rather than paradoxically, in fact, numbers are more important for strategy than tactics in reality, right? Anyhow, for today we stop here. So I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.